Thankful for joining us for round 4 already of Leader to Leader with MASSP. If you haven't already, please do introduce yourself in the chat function and be sure to include your name, your school, your role, maybe what's something you're looking forward to, or what's something that you did this week to make an impact. So let's liven it up, introduce ourselves, where you're from, what's your role, what's something you're looking forward to, or something that you're proud of from the week that you made an impact with. Thank you for joining us today. If you haven't already, please do enter your name into the chat. Keep yourself muted unless you're called on. We will be using the chat function today to moderate questions as they come up. We are planning to go through quite a bit of information as we go today based on what's been provided. So we're looking forward to where we are. If you do not have your camera on, as a social emotional learning activity, please do, if you do have the functionality, to put your cameras on so we can see our faces. For many of us, we are extroverts and love to be interacting with people. And unfortunately, as we're staying home alone, we don't all have that opportunity. So if you haven't yet, please do turn on your camera if it's possible, but remain muted. With us today, the MASSP Leader to Leader is Wendy Zadeb, our Executive Director, Steve Seward, Ryan Casey, and Matt Alley. In addition to us, Bob Kefjan and I will be moderating today's session. My name is Colin Master, so we're looking forward to working with you as we go through today. The executive order and town hall debrief is where we're going to start. Then we're going to get into grades and credits, including the NCAA. And then we're going to get into the budget, labor issues, end of year activities, commencement, and thinking forward. So with that, we're going to start with plan. Please note, because this has come up a couple times, that we as an association are providing you the best guidance and responses we can based on the information from April 8th through April 8th, and it's intended to just be that, to guide our thinking. Secondly, remember, all actions a district takes must be dependent on the most current EO, and we're going to get another one, or at least some guidance some more this afternoon, it sounds like, after this webinar, connected to your continuity of learning plan, as well as specific realities of your unique system. Remember, as principals, you are one leg within this stool that keeps it up and running. And what we need to make sure that we are doing is that we are consulting with and collaborating with district leadership, teachers, student leaders, and Board of Education. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bob to start us out with some information around the executive order with the following themes.
Thank you, Colin. So sort of an overarching theme I want to start with is something that came up during MASSP's town hall with the governor yesterday. And it was a question raised by one of our members, and to paraphrase her, she said, "I keep hearing the phrase school is canceled, but families and students are reacting to say that they can't be held back. Why engage in learning?" And the answer from the governor's office was very clear, that the expectation is continued learning. It's not going to look the same everywhere. It's not going to be perfect, that there are going to be hiccups and issues, but that the expectation moving forward is continued learning. And I start with that because it sort of provides a frame for everything that you guys are working on in your districts right now with your continuity of learning plans. It provides a frame for a lot of the issues that we're going to be dealing with. If we accept that the expectation is continued learning, and that the expectation for our students is that they continue to engage and learn, there are no free passes on this. We need to be compassionate. We need to recognize that we're going to have differential access and abilities, but we need to push forward with learning to the best of our ability at this point. Some other high-level themes I wanted to take away were from yesterday's webinar were an acknowledgement of the social-emotional learning and student mental health issues that are coming out of all of this. Many students rely on schools for way more than just basic learning. It is an emotional support mechanism. It provides a safe place for many students. And there's a recognition from the governor's office that this is something that they're going to need to deal with, and that they frankly just don't have an answer to right this minute. So they're looking at what they can do. They're looking at ways that they can be supportive, and they're asking that schools do their best as well to continue not just educating the academic student, but educating the whole child. You guys are dealing right now with developing your continuity of learning plans. And in dealing with that, we're finding out so much of what we don't know. And I think it's important at the beginning of all of this to acknowledge how many things we don't know. One of those things we don't know is what's going to happen next. And that's probably the biggest unknown, right? We don't know where this is going. We don't know how long all of this is going to last. We don't really have a good indication of when life is going to return to some level of normalcy. What I think we need to look at in all of this, though, is, and this is something that we asked the governor yesterday, what opportunities can we take away from this? What's the silver lining? What can we do to support students? And the governor and her staff acknowledged that walking out of this, we're going to hopefully have a better idea of ways that we can provide support to students at a distance, that we're going to be able to address some of these concerns that have been raised over the years that we've not necessarily dealt with in a thoughtful way, like the ongoing issues with snow days every year and the ways that we've been waiving those, and that we're learning lessons and building, while we're building the plane in the air, we're also building a system to deal with future crises. So acknowledging that and knowing that there isn't a ton that we can do to control this. Colin, could you skip ahead to the next slide, please? The executive order and town hall brief from the governor, I think, provides maybe some of the best guidance we can have on this, which is, instead of thinking about strict compliance, we need to focus on the other five other C values: common sense, compassion, creativity, and collaboration. And so when we run into these issues where we don't have good answers, we don't have good information, where we're doing our best, I think we need to, as the sign says there, yield to common sense and use what we have available to us in order to make the best decisions we can for students at the time.
I think as we do that, just like today, we're having to adjust. Our first time we're being Zoom bombed and not having had that experience with some of the other things. So how do we adjust? Imagine if this was a kindergarten classroom right now, or a ninth grade classroom, or a senior class. Regardless of grade level, I think it's an opportunity for us to adjust, adapt, and just know that this is part of the new realities we live in. And some people are looking for ways to fill their time that aren't always constructive. Keep in mind that as we do this, there are some silver linings. It's an opportunity for us to stay on the side of compassion and to adjust based on what we need to do. It's an opportunity for us to reconnect with kids with less of a academic to an extreme sense, but looking at them as individuals and what they need, and using this almost like off-season conditioning from an athletic point of view to strengthen pieces that may be gaps now for our students. We know that there's going to be concerns with our student teachers and with others and how this might affect the pipeline that's coming forward. But know that our governor has been very intentional about moving forward. He's consulting with her staff as well as the ed organization. So as we go forward, we don't know necessarily what's around that curve, and that each and every one of us are doing our best based on the information we have to provide for our students. My one caution is to avoid false starts, is to take the time to collaborate with the people you are dealing with. I've already had several phone calls and webinars today where plans that were submitted yesterday and already approved by ISDs are creating havoc for not only principals within buildings, but for teachers, because what was put into the plan is not necessarily something that's easily scalable throughout the districts, and that's causing issues for many of our principals and obviously our teachers and our students. So the old adage of go slow to go far is an important piece about what we need to be thinking through as leaders. Secondly, what we want to keep in mind is as we manage this change, it's around the vision, skills, incentive, resources, and action plans. If we forget to have a vision of what this is going to look like a week from now, 2 weeks from now, or a month from now, we're going to have confusion. If we don't address the skills of our teachers and our students and our families to access and facilitate, we're going to have a great deal of anxiety. If we don't provide incentives, whether that's through our grading or through the opportunities and the interactions, we'll have gradual release issues, and people will be slow to adopt and implement. The lack of resources, which is what many are doing, is causing frustration. And those of us who are trying in a hurry to get things going, is causing these false starts that's causing problems. So as we go into this next phase, one of the things to keep in mind is our gradings, practices, and how we approach those. So one of the questions that we keep getting is around grades and everything that goes with that. What we need to keep in mind is that the continuity of learning plans need to be reasonable and appropriate. And so as we go forward with this reasonable and appropriate, schools need to pivot from these remote instructions. So how do we do that? How might we approach that as we're going forward? So as you think about this, think about the impact of pass-fail in some of the other pieces that are there. Oops. Trying to manage the photo bomber in this. So what are options and implications for assigning grades? What are some things we need to think about for college admissions and NCAA? What are some things as far as schools on trimesters and quarters, as well as collecting and grading remotely? So with that, what I'd like you to think about is some of the guidance that's already put out there. In many states, the guidance was going directly to a pass-fail approach. And the purpose for that was under the guidance of do no harm. As we think deeper about do no harm, we also have to keep in mind that do no harm is also for students who are looking at NCAA eligibility, as well as students who are looking to get into colleges and universities. So as you think about do no harm when it comes to grades, it may be that you want to look at pass-fail for anything moving forward. But the guidance that we initially put out there was specific to the opportunity for students to have their grade as of March 10th be their lowest grade that they would earn for this semester. And the purpose for doing that was the notion that that's where they were at this time. If you're on trimesters, it's likely the place that you were for issuing the grades. If you're on a semester, it may have been 1/4 of it, or it may have been part of a cumulative. So by looking at this and thinking through that being the lowest grade, and then part 2 is as students engage in this work and they continue with their learning, they have the opportunity to improve that grade. And so in doing so, that may be going in the reverse and making up assignments from the past, engaging in learning activities around some of the content that they were struggling with in the past, or it may be looking at projects or online types of opportunities like credit recovery to improve going forward. But this notion that if kids continue to do the work and make improvements, they can only improve that grade. For some, they say, what about those students who they have no incentive to continue to do it? When we say continue to give a grade, that doesn't mean that that final grade couldn't be an incomplete. So if you're looking at it from the sense of holding people accountable, or you're looking at it from the sense of incentivizing students to continue to work going forward, that's where the incomplete can come in. So a student's lowest grade they might have is a B, but if they do nothing else, that could be an incomplete until they do complete the required work that you were expecting going through the rest of this quarter. Some other options that people are looking at is moving towards an A, B, C, D, no credit or incomplete, while others are looking at an ABC credit incomplete, and others even to the point of AB no credit or incomplete. The ideas behind that type of a grading approach is that even with the NCAA eligibility then, that if you had a A or B, then that likely isn't going to hurt your eligibility if that's where you were before. But then having the opportunity afterwards to elect to go with a credit or no credit may be something that would be beneficial for a student who's looking at it. Keep in mind that for NCAA purposes, they are currently interpreting any pass or credit as a D or a D minus, depending on what's the lowest passing grade. So that may calculate as a 0.67 or 1.0. Know that MASSP has been consistently in contact with the NCAA, knowing that over 90% of our country is shut down right now, and many states have already moved forward with that in their guidance. We know that the NCAA may adjust what that policy is. However, right now it is the practice that they have adopted, and it's up to the college presidents to change that practice. Knowing that Harvard and MIT and Michigan State, and several others have moved in this direction for some as an option to elect that, it wouldn't surprise me if that's coming, but we can't bank on that as we're going forward. Bob, do you want to add to that part?
The thing I would add on this is that unlike a lot of other areas where we don't necessarily have great questions, the answer on this one is actually pretty clear, which is issues with grading, issues with how we assign grades or which grades we assign truly are local control issues. It's been, the governor's staff acknowledged this yesterday. We've had this put out there pretty clearly. While we understand that there are implications for the NCAA most immediately and potential long-term issues with college admissions, these are decisions that you are entirely empowered to make locally. There is no question about the legality or what the order is from the governor's office on these things. As Colin said, while we have reached out to the NCAA, it's worth keeping in mind that this is something that's happening everywhere in the country. I would be shocked if there wasn't some recognition of that moving forward and some accommodation made for these sorts of the situation.
So one of the questions that came up in here as it related to grading is specific to packets. And so districts that are going with packets, what are you doing to get them back? And how are you assessing them? And how are they accessing? So right now, the EO says that parents of students are able to come to schools to pick up packets or other learning material, but the students are not themselves. We may get additional guidance later that would allow that to move forward, but currently it's only the parents are that. So people are distributing packets through their meals program. They're distributing packets through bus stops. They also, some have now, since the guidance came out, setting up packets spread out around the cafeterias and or gym spaces, and then exercising appropriate social distancing that way. As packets go home, there are several different ways that people are receiving those packets. One is that parents are returning those to school, either when they pick up the next packet or they're mailing them back to school. Many have said they don't want the packets back because once they get the packets back, there's a possibility of that. So another option that people are doing is having students take pictures of the work they have and either emailing them or texting them as pictures back to the school as an opportunity as they're going through there. It is up to the school on how they want to be able to do that as a piece of that credit piece. Another question came up around E20, 20 or Odysseyware for credit recovery, and people who are saying, how do we monitor students and their assessments and their grades? So as far as monitoring progress, that's quite easy when you're using those credit recovery softwares. But when it comes to actually proctoring the assessments, I would say that at this point, that's probably the least of our concerns, is monitoring those pieces and testing with you. So options that people have considered is actually having students come to an office hour, if you will, that's virtual to take the assessment. Some people are opening up windows when students have taken the assessment. Some are just having the students take the test whenever they're ready, and then they're clearing it once they have it. And then the other part that people are looking at is providing some type of other formative assessment that the school creates versus the one in Odysseyware. And it's less of a multiple choice true false and something that students can do in order to do that. The other piece that came with that had to do with we'd like MASSP's perspective on students that may have access to and are comfortable or confident completing their courses for a grade during the time of closure. Should they have an opportunity to earn a grade, or is this coming? So I think what we said before is that by having a two-pronged approach where students are able to take their last best grade there and then improve it, or a second tier then would be for them to be able to have that assessment. Another question was, our staff is focused on compassion over compliance and providing learning opportunities, and grace in accepting work given the unique circumstances and variables with internet accessibility and poverty. So teachers are asking how to address credit, no credit, or passing complete, because they're used to assigning a grade. So if a student was getting 60% completed, or they turned in 60% of their work, they'd give it credit. But if they didn't, they would go with no credit. And so one of the things that I'd encourage you to do is continue to embrace the compassion over compliance, but I'd start to shift away from this idea that grades or credit, no credit is based on a percent completed or a percent turned in. I think as we start to think about this work, we can look at it at a basic level, like homework. When you're in elementary school, you got to check, plus, or a minus, or you might go to a credit, partial credit, no credit, as you do with many math assignments and that. That might be the starting place as you're getting up and running, that if that's where your teachers are, is more from that external, might be a simple way to go. As that starts to grow and people become comfortable, then I think we start to push more towards teachers providing formative feedback and worrying less about whether or not they had a certain percent. In that type of case, what the teacher would do is, in response to the student, is make sure they named for the students what they did do, and then either have the student come up with one or two things they might work on next, or the teacher might. In doing this, the teacher is able to give them credit if they met the targets, or they could say incomplete, now go back and do these things, and then earn the credit. Another way, many schools have teachers who are being told they need to come up with learning targets about what they want students to learn in a lesson, coming up with some type of project, activity, or assignment that students can use to demonstrate their learning, so a performance task, and then providing students clear criteria of what success might look like with their expectations. And in this case, it becomes even simpler to do. So for example, if one of my learning targets in an English class was to get students to cite textual evidence to support their positions about the socias and greasers and who's really the true outsiders, a student might write a paragraph or a response with whatever system you're using regarding who the true outsiders are and if the socias or greasers are there. And that if they take a position, cite pieces of textual evidence, and include 3 to 4 sentences interpreting it, they have met the criteria and they're issued credit. Conversely, if they didn't do those things, they might be able to then take a no, incomplete at this time, but make it up. To take that a step further, maybe somebody's looking at an A, B, no credit. So if they met the expectation by those criteria, they get the B. If they go beyond those criteria, they get the A. If they didn't meet the expectation, they could get an incomplete and provided another opportunity. So those are some ideas of how to approach that grading there. As you think about these pieces and additional options for adjusting, some people are thinking about the remainder of the year and what additional options are there for schedules and credits and that type of thing. So NCAA has told us you don't need to resubmit your courses as you're going forward. The courses you have approved for NCAA Clearinghouse are good to go. What you might do is in your master schedule, add the, in parentheses after course title, COVID-19, just as a reminder that these courses that students were taking during this trimester or during this semester were part of the school closure and may indicate why those students have credit, no credit, or that type of piece. Another thing that people are doing is saying we're not going to continue with the exact courses that students have right now. We're aware of several schools that by grade level or departments, they're putting together interdisciplinary or disciplinary specific projects or tasks for students to do. and they're either awarding the credit, like a 2.5 credit on a trimester or 1.5 credit on a semester, or whatever your schedule is for that project. So those are some ways that people are starting to look at credit and address that, particularly those who are on trimesters where you may not have students who have met with their teachers and how to go forward within that. The other piece that was going on with that, where's it at? Bob, I just noticed you were going to add a comment in there.
Well, the comment I was going to add was regarding seniors, because the question came up yesterday on the webinar. What about seniors who we feel comfortable awarding credit or grade to this point? Is there an expectation that they continue learning for the rest of the year? The answer, and I've heard different variations on this, but essentially the expectation is that you can award credit or grade to the point that the senior is, that you absolutely need to provide opportunities for makeup work. But if you have decided that the seniors completed their work, that you could certainly let that senior graduate without requiring them to complete any additional work or any additional continuing learning, and still have that count as their grade or credit for the year, the work that they've done to this point. So as you're developing your continuity of learning plans and considering how you're going to handle those seniors in graduation, keep that part in mind.
So as it comes to grading and credits and implications for schools on trimesters and quarters or semesters, or collecting the work, are there some remaining questions? Those are the ones that we've had come in that we tried to address. But if you have additional ones specific to those three topics, please add them to the chat and we'll address that before going to our next piece.
And while folks are typing, I would note that if we're going along, we're going to be going through, we've had a number of questions asked, but don't hesitate to type additional questions into the chat. If it's something we know we're going to get to, we'll cover it. And if it isn't something that we're planning to cover, that will spark us to cover it as well. So as we're going along, please feel free to add your questions to the chat as we move along.
As we do that, I leave you with this quote from a Greek physician that said, "In desperate times require desperate measures." And I would say that we are in these desperate times dealing with adverse circumstances. So as we go forward, we may not have the best choices. And so some of the choices we have are going to be challenging to make. But as just put in the chat now, being reasonable and appropriate is critical. When it comes to grading, one of the foremost thinkers on this comes from the University of Kentucky by the name of Thomas Guskey. And I appreciated Thomas Guskey's work around this. And recently he wrote an article, a blog post, and in it he said, when it comes to grading, it's all about making student learning the primary focus. How do we help students take that same focus? And the solution was ensuring the criteria we establish for passing are clear, rigorous, and attainable. And then, and this is the key piece to me, do everything within our power to help all students meet those challenges. In face-to-face learning, we have a number of students each and every day who already struggle with understanding what the teacher's expectations are and what success looks like. Imagine now where they don't have that face-to-face contact in order to ask questions or follow up or hear from their peers each and every day. So think about on a rainy day or in the middle of the winter in Michigan as the rain or the fog comes up and everything else. How do we help through our opportunities and support, working and connecting with students, to be a windshield to help students see more clearly what it is we expect of them and how they might be able to move forward with their own work. This is an important piece, particularly as we think about our schools. So I know that this morning as I was on a conference call with principals from the Ottawa, Kent, Muskegon area for the OK conference, one of the things that came up is about some schools that were on trimesters looking at potentially having seniors be done based on where they were, and even some semester schools. And they were possibly having, and so they were able to focus on those seniors that were having credit recovery. One of the questions that came up is, what do we do with those senior teachers? That then led to one of the principals asking, what about elective teachers? So if I have a CTE class or something else that may not be replicable or doable at home. And so one of the things we talked about was, how do we use those teachers? How do we use our support staff? How do we use our counselors, administrators, intervention people to actually serve as mentors and coaches? So although they may not have the content expertise, they have the relationships and they have the time to reach out and support kids, whether that be kind of a surrogate coach, whether that be a surrogate parent, whether it just is a caring adult that checks in with you. How can we utilize them so that those students who elect either not to engage or don't have the access to engage have the knowledge that they aren't alone and that people are watching and caring?
So as we move into the budget section of this, I seem to be on task to take up all of the areas of our presentation today where we just don't have answers. But this was something that was raised yesterday with the governor. It's been an ongoing conversation as part of what I've been dealing with legislators, with other lobbyists, looking ahead. I've been on probably 4 webinars in the last 2 days with various officials from the executive and legislative branches talking about budget. And the short answer on budget is also pretty much the long answer on budget, which is that we just simply don't know what impact this crisis is going to have moving forward as relates to budget. So we don't know what's going to happen to tax revenue. We anticipate an economic outcome, an economic impact, but we don't know how big it's going to be. We don't know how long it's going to last. We don't know what the recovery is likely to look like. We don't know where our budgets will end up. What we do know on all of this is at least a rough timeline. So the next consensus revenue estimating conference is in mid-May. That is always when the legislature and the executive branch sit down and come to consensus on how much revenue, the final revenue numbers that they're going to use in setting the budget for the next year. And in this case, we're talking about the 2020-2021 school year. So by mid-May, we will have at least the numbers set that the legislature and governor are going to be using for next year. So that moving forward, we'll be able to respond to that. Now, those numbers may change as this drags on. If the economic impacts end up being greater than is projected in May, then there could be adjustments. I've heard questions about, are we going to be facing a current year proration? Are we going to be looking at a change in the per pupil next year? And the answer is, we simply don't know. We're only partway into this. And as much as it feels like, speaking as somebody who's locked in his basement with a 2- and 4-year-old tormenting him upstairs, it feels like it's been forever. It really hasn't been that long, and it's really way too soon to know how this is going to come out in the end. Other issues on budget or revenue that we want to talk about are federal stimulus. So we know we have a good deal of federal stimulus coming into Michigan right now. What we don't know is exactly how it's going to be spent. And we don't know exactly what our options are going to be for using that to support students, to support learning moving forward, nor how it's going to be used to support schools. So some of the questions that we got yesterday on our town hall with the governor's office that are also conversations I've had with the legislature are things around, how do we build infrastructure? How do we build out internet infrastructure? And is it appropriate to now consider this as a utility, in other words, so that it's something that folks need to have access to? How do we deal with equity issues, access to devices, access to internet in in rural communities, in impoverished communities, in urban communities? How do we ensure more universal access? And how do we support schools? Because educating students now and then having to re-educate those students later, that's doing work twice. And more work means additional cost. It's not reasonable to expect that everybody's just going to do all of this for free, or that there's no cost associated with all of the additional work that's going to come from recovering from this situation. So those are all things that the state is looking at as it sets budgets for next year and as it looks to spend federal stimulus dollars. Hopefully the federal stimulus dollars can help pick up some of those pieces that wouldn't otherwise be accounted for in a state level budget, while at the state level we're pushing as hard as we can, and we know the governor's office is pushing as hard as they can to push every available dollar into the foundation allowance so that schools have the ability to react to what the situation is in their community and appropriate those dollars in a way that's most responsive to their students' needs. Unfortunately, beyond that, we just simply don't know a whole heck of a lot about budget. But if you guys have any additional questions, I'm happy to try and answer them. But that's what I can tell you to this point based on the questions we've gotten so far.
So we did get some questions in the chat about the prior section. I'm going to finish up this budget piece, and then I'll address Dale's question and Aaron's question regarding seniors and specifically. So one of the other questions with budget that came up was specific to, as you think about funds for infrastructure, and that not all families are able to access internet services, whether that's in rural areas or suburban or urban areas, for matter of fact. We know that in the state of Michigan, about 80% of our state is covered, but it isn't equitable even within some of our wealthiest districts. I was speaking with the principal in Ann Arbor, which is the wealthiest median income county in our state. And they still had 8% of their families without any connectivity. So even though that's a small proportion, they still are looking at how can we do that, particularly since their plan was to move forward with new learning in a remote setting. For many of us, we may have more. Where my father lives up in Oceana County, only about 60% of their families have connectivity. And so what is it that can be done there? So we do know that there are solutions, whether that's the packets, like what people are sending. Some of you may be familiar with the For Me to You learning opportunities that MASSP publishes each Wednesday so that you can put those into your plans. Those count as extended learning opportunities and meet the guidance that's in the MAISA there. So as a low cost, low workload or capacity on your part, that's something you can either send out, post, or print and distribute from you as principals to your families. That engages them in, they hear words of wisdom from you that we author for you as ghostwriters. It includes some daily activities. It includes daily current events. And it also includes family interactions through challenges and daily conversation starters that we provide. So that could count as part of your plan if you're looking for something to supplement or supplant or to be the focus of it. In addition to that, we have a new thing that came out that actually is being used in 30 school districts right now and has already been approved in some of the Kent County plans called Maven Solution. And the great part about it is it's something that you can attend a 1-hour webinar, learn how it works, come back for a second one, and after that second webinar, you will be set up to go with your students, and every day at midnight, a message card will go to your students that includes a short little reading, a video clip that's career-oriented, and then an opportunity for a check for understanding and career exploration. That's the bonus pieces of that. And so that's another one, and the benefit of that is it all works through a mobile device. And we are testing it out, and where my dad's at with a HuNet, where he has very slow DSL service and no cellular service, it was able to run like it was on high-speed internet. It's so low capacity as far as drawing the bandwidth. It also works on 2G, which is 100% of our state is covered by 2G. And so it will run if there's the pieces there. So there's some pieces that way that people are looking to as a way from an equity to be able to provide that. As far as the seniors go and the questions that were this, there is no consensus. I think across our state, there's There's varying degrees. I would say that we have a continuum from we're continuing with our seniors and our 9th through 11th grade students as if school never stopped. We're just doing it remotely. They're doing day-to-day instruction and dealing with some of the FAPE issues and challenges that come with that. At the farthest end of the extreme, what we're finding is that there are some people that, because the continuity of learning plans technically don't have to start until April 28th, and for many schools, their last day of seniors may have been that first week of May, they're looking at something like a project that students can do. For some students, it may take them a week. For some students, it may take them a month. But they're turning it into like the senior project. It reminds me of when I was at Hope College and we had May term. And so I was able to take a 3 or a 6 credit class. It was interdisciplinary. I was able to explore and stuff. And it was something that I was able to continue on and include. So there's pieces there. 2, there are some schools in that area that are saying seniors who are on track to graduate, they've earned the credits they need to based on what Bob mentioned earlier about credits and grades, and that is completely a local district decision. So if as a district, your district says, and this would take board and central office support, that your seniors have met the graduation requirements, then those kids can be set free and then focus your energy on those seniors that were not on track to graduate and use these next few weeks to get them caught up, whether they were losing credit this semester or in the past. So knowing what's reasonable and appropriate, knowing what your capacity is, it's really about making the most of it. So MASSP is not endorsing one method over the other. Our endorsement or guidance is specific to do what's reasonable and appropriate for your students given your local context. I know Tawny's on here from up in Atlanta, Michigan, and what she needs versus what my colleague in Grand Haven has, Tracy Wilson, are much different resources and connectivity. And so what they need or what Jim French needs over in Portage Northern, or Kelly needs where she's at. All of us have different students with different access and opportunities. And so the benefit of the executive order and the guidance that came out is do what's able to be done for yours. I know in some counties they're using the continuity of learning plan, includes the weekly from me to you as the base piece, and then some teachers are providing packets. So it doesn't have to be school the way it was. It's what can be done in the time that's available with the resources that's available. So I pulled this quote: "There is nothing certain but the uncertain. So when nothing is assured, everything is possible." So as we go forward, keep in mind that everything's on the table. You have that great responsibility with your teachers, with your families, with your board and your central office administrators to figure out what can we do with the resources that are available to service our students for the time that's there. Recognizing that this approach to remote learning is based on the seat time waiver language that's already in statute and the MDE guidance, which is waiving the hours and days requirement and looking at what learning is needed moving forward and then crafting a plan. So what I would suggest when you're looking at that is, as a district, figuring out what are the essential content that you need going forward. So for example, one of the things that we're exploring in that OK Red this morning was this idea that, or the OK conference with 3 of the colors represented there, was what do kids need in 10th grade English to start out the year right? So could we use these last 9 weeks, not trying to continue with the existing curriculum as written, but could we have 10th grade teachers say, these are what kids need to be set up for success in 10th grade. So as a 9th grade teacher, what is it I can focus on to pre-teach, to front load what kids are gonna get next year? If I'm an algebra teacher, what is it in geometry they're going to need that first unit, knowing that the first few weeks of school set the tenor and the tone for the rest of the school year? How do we front load students so that when they enter school, they're able to access it? If I'm a biology teacher, what are some pieces from biology that's going to set them up for chemistry? So thinking less about necessarily adding all this new learning around everything that's in our overall curriculum, and think more about setting students up for the future. As you know, our state curriculum is even written often, other than the some of the math ones in science, are written in grade level bands. So like 9, 10 ELA and 11, 12 ELA, or science and the inquiry and the problem solving standards across there. So as a district, when we think about literacies, can we focus on those literacy essentials between now and the end of the year? In math, rather than thinking about every lesson 6.2 and 6.3, can we be looking at those standards of mathematical practice and put together some projects or activities around that? In science, can we set up some inquiries or some investigations that kids can do around their house that would hit those essential practices? In social studies, how are we looking at those 6 C's of a civically minded in that type of community and taking care of it? So I think those are things that came up that would be really important as we go forward. There is no one size fits all, and so we have to use what we do have to the best of our ability.
The other thing I'd add to that, Colin, is that one of the greatest frustrations I've heard from principals, other educators during the time that I've been doing my job, is frustration that so much of education has become micromanaged by Lansing. This is an odd situation, and it's certainly not ideal. But one of the things that's been done here is to strip away so much of the regulation that's bound up education. It's not how I would want to have to deliver instruction, but remember that what we're doing here is stripping away a lot of the things that have been required for a number of years and really giving educators a great deal of trust and flexibility to do what the best you can. And that's, while challenging, also empowering. So I would keep that in mind moving forward.
The next topic we're going to hit on is labor issues, and it's Bob and I's favorite topic. And it's one of the topics that has some of the most unanswered questions and conflicting guidance, depending on who you're talking to. So some of the themes of this area are evaluations, who are essential staff, and what does stay home mean, layoff recall, non-renewals, IDPs, all of the fun stuff that's part of our job with that. So the first thing that we want to hit is the question I get the most. Are we required to provide evaluations for staff? And what the answer is the executive order says the district says that strict compliance, so the key word that lawyers are around is strict compliance. So the EO says that strict compliance is not required. Some have interpreted strict compliance as do as much of the law as possible, while others are saying you have it waived or exempt. Okay? But the issue is all these laws start to get intertwined. So if you don't do an evaluation, how do you deal with non-renewals? How do you deal with layoff or recall? What are you doing about merit pay? What are you doing about any teacher that's on an IDP or probationary teachers and the things that are in the Tenure Act, which this EO did not address? So a conservative interpretation is do as much of the evaluation requirements as possible, knowing that you also have post-scene assurances that you're bound up against. On the flip side, some people are saying, I want to do evaluations. I had my observations done. We have 3 years of data because it's not just this current year's of data. We're using prior year data too. Or the law says that you can use or whatever's available. Some people are saying, hey, we never had our our MSTEP or PSAT or SAT data anyways in time for evaluation. So we're going to use the prior 3 years or the prior 2 years. So the law does permit you to continue to evaluate staff based on the evidence you have. Be careful not to contradict your post-scene assurances or work through with your union that there's going to be modifications to the post-scene assurances of validity, reliability, and efficacy. Because my bet is if anybody's laid off because of your evaluation, those posting assurances will be used as part of the leverage on why something was right or wrong that way. So yes, you may do it, but do so with great caution, just like how much learning you provide based on what's rigorous, valid, and reliable.
The other thing I'd add to that, Colin, is that what the EO says is it's two parts. It's strict compliance, and to the extent that it waives the requirement to provide an evaluation under 1249. So not only do you have some flexibility with if you want to do an evaluation, or if your if your central office is telling you you need to do evaluations, or if your district legal counsel is telling you do evaluations, you have some flexibility within this as to exactly what you have to do or how you have to do it, because what's waived is not just the requirement that you have to do a 1249 evaluation, but strict compliance with 1249. So if there are pieces that you might be missing that would otherwise be required under 1249, you have some latitude within this to deal with those things, given that strict compliance is waived. And if you can document and show that you're making your best effort, then you probably are going to be reasonably well covered.
One of the things to think about as an example of what's possible, if you have a probationary teacher, you created an IDP or a growth plan, whatever your district called for them in the fall or last year if they're in their second year or later. So you've been in their classroom doing some observations. So one of the things that you might do between now and June 30th is write a response to how is that teacher's practice grown, how have they progressed with their IDPs, and so you're giving them the feedback part that's required within the Tenure Act and suggesting as we return to school in the fall, here's some things that I'd like you to work on. So that's completely permissible. It's likely something you can do remotely from home based on the evidence you have. It's not saying that you necessarily rated every indicator or row of the rubric or calculated a final effectiveness grade, although you might. It does allow you to let them know how they're progressing with their IDP, which is one of the parts of the Tenure Act, and identifying what they might work on going into this next school year. The same could be said for a tenured teacher who's on an IDP or some type of corrective action plan. You might take some time to reflect on how they've progressed during the year up through March 11th and provide them feedback on that with specific goals or recommended training going into the following year. Okay. The EO hasn't affected the timelines for non-renewals of administrators or probationary teachers. So a tenured teacher has to be notified of non-renewal 60 days before the end of the year, which meant that your Board of Education would have had to take action to non-renew a tenured teacher by March 30th. For administrators, it's a different date. And so for administrators, they need to be made aware of non-renewal by April 30th. For probationary teachers, note that that date is 15 days before the end of the school year, which is June 15th. So the Supreme Court in Michigan ruled many years ago that the end of the school year for legislative purposes or legal purposes is June 30th, regardless of what your school calendar is. So all of these mandates that go with that are based on the June 30 end of the school year, so you back it up. So probationary teacher non-renewal notices have to be provided 15 days before, so that's June 15th. And remember, you can dismiss a probationary teacher at any time as long as they've had their IDP and you've done their observations and mid-year review pieces that go with that. Tenured teachers and or probationary. So here's the other exception. If you have a teacher who's in their second year of probation with you, but they were tenured in another Michigan school district for purposes of non-renewal, it's the 60-day notice. So if you have any probationary teacher that was tenured only in Michigan other schools and they're in their second year, that non-renewal notice had to have already happened too. So that's passed that way. So that's a piece that is there. Another question that came up has to do with essential workers and unions are refusing to have their members report to perform essential duties. So what do we do when the district's redeploying staff and or having staff refuse to work because of the stay-home order? The legal guidance from Lusk and Albertson, and I think it's paralleled with Troon, although I don't have that directly in front of me. Lusk and Albertson said they can't with good reason, they cannot refuse without good reason. Otherwise, it could be a disciplinary or termination situation. So focus should be on those items that if they are refusing, it has to be for reasons that are within their contract or state or federal law. So for example, somebody on FMLA, you can't penalize them for being out on that. Somebody who contracted coronavirus or is ill that way can't. If a healthcare provider, because of somebody's pre-existing condition, has quarantined or told them to be isolated, then you can't require them to report to work. If they've been advised from a healthcare provider, you may ask for some guidance from that with your attorneys, but what we've been told is that you can ask for some type of notice or documentation that they should not have to report to work. They can't get into the details because of HIPAA that way. But as you're thinking about who your staff are, I've worked with schools that they're taking their security staff, they're taking their parapro staff, they're taking their secretarial staff, and they're using them in mentor coaching roles. And so how do we start to do that as we're going forward that way? One of the questions that we had is, are schools required to have 6 hours of work each day for all hourly staff to participate in the order for them to be paid? Nothing in the order says that a full day of work has to be 6 hours. I can't imagine for some of us sitting at a computer for 6 hours without a break. What it is you're a salary employee, and so think about it as we're providing services to our families, and so whatever it takes to be able to do that is where it is. It doesn't need to be a time clock for our teachers and administrators from that end.
So another question that we've gotten a lot of is around IDPs, and can you still put a teacher on an IDP or a plan for next year? And the answer to that is pretty simply that appropriate administrative personnel, including evaluators, can always put a teacher on an IDP at any time, as long as it's developed in consultation with the teacher, includes specific performance goals and any recommended PD, instructional support and or coaching to achieve those performance goals. So yes, and you certainly don't have to wait to do that. That can be done at any time. The last quick thing on labor I wanted to hit was third-party contractors. This is a sticky issue. The EO is silent on third-party contractors, but we're getting a lot of questions from folks who say, well, can I pay my third-party contractors? I'm worried about losing good people. Remember, you should never be paying the employees of third-party contractors. That establishes an employment relationship with them. But as long as they're providing work and you've got a contract, you may need to amend that contract. But as long as they're providing services, you can certainly continue to pay them.
The next section is end of year activities and commencements. And we will have another Leader to Leader next week at 1 o'clock. We're trying to get these to an hour. Unfortunately, I got distracted by our Zoom bomber, and I didn't do a good job of keeping us focused, moving along that way. But we will have another Leader to Leader where we'll get into continued FAQs and other things. But for this last part, thinking about commencement and end of the school year. It sounds like there may be an extension to the stay home, stay safe order. We know that schools aren't going to be reopened. And so as a result of that, the likelihood that you're going to be able to do something with your students before the end of the school year, even any type of face-to-face activity, is likely not going to happen. So as you're thinking forward, I know some of you have looked at postponing commencement till summer. Some of you have looked at postponing commencement and putting something together with homecoming or some other back to school activities. And others have looked at doing either a virtual homecoming, and we've worked with Jostens to put together a toolkit for that. So at an upcoming Leader to Leader, we're going to actually spend quite a bit more time with secondary or high school folks specific to that. And then the other piece that people are looking at, particularly in some of the smaller rural schools, is personal or individual graduation, that once the stay home order is lifted, but the order not to congregate in large group is there, is getting students their cap and gowns and everything, and then the principal, superintendent possibly going to homes and delivering diplomas for photo ops and that type of thing. So those are the types of opportunities we're seeing now, but we're not anticipating that people are going to be able to do a face-to-face type commencement before the end of this school year. So some other considerations as you're thinking about commencements is also when you do the other. I know one of our people on here, her son is already signed up for and is enlisted and going into the Army. And I don't know his date for deployment, but I know my neighbor's son is going, and his deployment date is June 15th. So he's not going to be around later for graduation. So what are we doing for those seniors that are going into the military or some other obligation that takes them abroad or across our nation and able to honor them? We've been seeing people do tons of different things from daily senior honors type things where they're sending it out to working with their local newspaper and news to honor their seniors that way as they're going to social media posts. So those are some of the things that are going on there. But we do want people to start thinking about, as tough as it is, what's the alternative moving forward, given the likelihood that the stay home, stay safe order is going to be extended at least through May or the beginning of May, and likely will continue forward. In fact, some of the pieces we're hearing from Michigan is that the apex from the governor's town hall might even be into late summer. So we have to keep focused on what we can do. So even thinking ahead to what's fall sports going to look like and back to school. So we're going to spend more time on that in the future, but those are some of the topics that way. As you
Colin,
start
can you skip ahead one slide?
Yep.
So, no, 2 slides. Sorry. One more. No, not that one. There, that one. The one with the curves. Just as you're thinking about this, remember that as we have success in flattening the curve, that's the phrase we keep hearing, right, is flattening the curve. What that means is that we're keeping the rate of infection below the healthcare system capacity so that we don't overwhelm hospitals. But as you can see from this graphic, and this is not representative of any particular state or Michigan, but the idea is that if you can flatten the curve to keep it under health system capacity, you're going to stretch out the time during which this is happening. So if we're successful and if we do flatten the curve out so that we're keeping under healthcare system capacity, and that keeps more people safe and we're less likely to have poor outcomes from this, the result is going to be that we are stretching this out, which to Colin's point means that you really should be looking ahead at long-term implications and long-term impact into the summer and into the fall.
So as we start to think forward, it reminds me of an old story a college professor said about the mason jar and what we put in it. And he talks about in life that we often get bogged down with the details and in the minutia. And as a result of that, we have no room for the things that are important in life. And so as we go forward, I want you to think about what are those rocks, those pebbles in the sand within remote learning. To me, and this is Colin speaking now, those big rocks, those stones are the relationships you have with your students. It's the basic needs that you're providing for and the wellness for your families and your staff. It's about that social emotional connection and doing no harm. It's about going slow together so that we can provide equitable solutions for everybody. We're a people business dealing with children. We have lives in our hands each and every day. And as we touch that future, how do we do no harm while at the same time providing what's reasonable and appropriate? As we take care of those needs, what are the next things that we can do to be able to revisit and strengthen essential skills through supplemental and enrichment opportunities? And if all those things start to take place and you still have room and capacity to do it, then let's think about what that new learning is. Not that new learning is minutia, but in the big scheme of things and basic needs, it needs to be the thing that comes in after the others. So as you go forward, if you're able to do the stones for the rest of the year, those rocks, that's good. If you're able to do the pebbles for the rest of the year, that's acceptable. And if you're able to do the sand with new learning, thank goodness for you and what you can do for your community. What you do and at the level you do it is the best you can with what you have, which reminds me of a statement out there about doing all the good you can by all the means you can, in all the ways you can, in all the places you can, for all the people you can, as long as you ever can. As educators, each and every day we get to touch the future. How are we going to touch the future tomorrow in order to improve conditions for our children, our families, our own personal families, and our teachers? So with that, we're going to be signing off. We appreciate you taking time to meet with us today and to pose your questions. We will be having another Leader to Leader next Thursday at 1 o'clock, where we'll be addressing additional questions. But these were the major ones that came up through the town hall that weren't addressed, as well as the last Leader to Leader. So once again, thank you for joining us today. We wish you well as you continue to research, develop, and plan for the rest of this school year.